you very much. So this is the starting point.
Good evening. I hope everybody can hear me. My name is Firsov. I studied in a college called City and Guilds, and I studied lots of historic carving. And today I want to share with you some research about Gothic architecture, and most specifically, I'm going to look at very quickly an essay about King's College, Cambridge. And then we're going to go into a practical session with drawing. And then I'm going to switch my camera over to the phone where we can see what I'm doing. Just to give you a quick brief on this, it's a chapel that dates back hundreds of years, and it was finished in the Renaissance. And it was a time in the 1500s when Gothic architecture was still going on in England, even though it had pretty much fallen out of fashion and become abandoned in Europe. It had been going on from about the 12th century, and it went on for about 300 years. And it was a strikingly different style to all of the architecture that had gone on before. And what was happening was that the ruins of the Roman Empire meant that lots and lots of stone structures had been left behind, and they discovered the way that they'd made vaults by Romans in the ruins of Rome. And these were very simple arches that crossed each other. And then they discovered another thing as well, because as Christian explorers and their architects were traveling to the Middle East, they would go to the Holy Land and they would travel further into Muslim countries. They would look at the architecture that they found there, and they found a sharp arch, a pointy arch. And this was an incredible revolution in building, because a round arch is only as limited as the circle, but the Gothic arch gives you an opportunity to go much higher. So the awe-inspiring atmosphere that we get when we walk into a Gothic chapel is that the windows can be very, very wide, and the space can be very, very tall, thanks to this pointy arch. So that's the kind of overview of what we're looking at and how that's different, because so far we've looked at the architecture of the ancient Greeks with the Ionic column. We've looked at the Baroque architecture with St. Peter's in Rome, and all this stuff basically copying the Roman temples. And then suddenly this Gothic style is something a little bit different, and it went on, and obviously it became more and more popular again in the revival period. So actually we get a lot of buildings today that going to go back to that period of the medieval. We're just going to look at this essay, and I've got a picture here of the interior of King's College, and the most interesting style that we have on the ceiling of this kind of vault, it's called a fan vault, and you can recognize it because in between these Gothic arches that go down in perspective, you can see these fan shapes that are made of stone. So they're kind of like rounded arches going around in a circle and pressing up against each other. So it's sort of like an arch in 3D that's gone into a keystone in the middle of the ceiling. So in this essay, I've got a picture. Mainly we're going to be looking at the pictures. Here's a picture of the side of this church. It's part of St. John's College, it's part of King's College in Cambridge. And it was the Royal Chapel for Henry VIII. And the most famous thing that you probably heard it for is the choir. So you're on the radio every year. The choir sings so well, and the acoustic is so beautiful in there that it's broadcast all over the world, really. If you look at this building, it doesn't necessarily strike you as completely European, because the kind of tall pinnacles on either end and the sharp Gothic windows look very, very oriental to the medieval eye, especially. It looks like something from the Middle East. And you can see that it has 12 different divisions or bays there, and then very large buttresses on the end of each division between the windows. So it's actually a kind of architecture that needs the external support. So all this had to be constructed on the lawn in front of you, as you can see, and carved in advance and then put up. And each section is a sort of self-holding arch with these buttresses on the outside, allowing for these very wide spaces for the window mullions and for the roof to be put up there. And so I've just sort of looked at how Gothic appeared, and obviously it appeared in France first, near Paris, in cities like Bourges, where the cathedrals went from round arches to these sharp Gothic arches. So in this page here is a picture of one of the first English Gothic cathedrals, and it was the time of King John, when the Masons were carving both French and English cathedrals. And then the Barons' War meant that actually the carvers and masons couldn't cross the channel anymore, a bit like Brexit. So those people were sort of left behind in England, and they started to experiment. And in Gloucester Cathedral, there is actually a 12th century vault that looks like this. And you can see on the diagrams at the bottom of the page, where the arches cross each other. The simplest idea is that you get the continuation of that Gothic shape in a tube in 3D. And then so you get these corners. So that's a sort of typical 4-part Roman vault. And the English development of that was to sort of turn that into these fans in between the arches. So here you can see the section from the top illustrated just where the roof would be. So this area is never seen in the chapel, and you can see a round sort of keystone in the middle that then kind of keystones around and presses up against all of the arches, and you get this kind of lozenge diamond shape that works in between, and so that's the sort of focal point in between each of the vaults. All the pressure is obviously going in different directions. So earlier cathedrals, once you start going around different cathedrals in England, you're going to see the same things happening. So in the top right corner, there's a picture of the cloisters at Gloucester. And this is the earliest fan vault. So it's quite bulky, but you can see the idea is that in the lozenge shape, there are lots and lots of circular kind of niches at the top. So what do these things represent? Well, they're sort of like the heavens being held up by tree-like ramuses or tree-like fans. So it's as if you're walking through a forest, and then above you are these stars that might be, you know, the stars in between the branches, or they might be, you know, special places for niches where sort of spiritual beings might exist. And obviously also there's all these Gothic arches subdividing. So actually another thing this refers to is the windows. So if we look at the side, in the windows, we can see these vertical mullions. And then those vertical mullions hold up circular, sort of many divided parts, which are also similar to the stars. They could be made of different amounts of leaves. So they could be called trefoils or quatrefoils or pentafoils, whatever it is. So you can see in a way that the idea of the design of the Gothic window has changed to the design of the vault. So it's as if the sort of window has gone into another dimension. And all this is concentric and continuing down straight corridors. So in the space, everything shrinks into perspective, and that's one of the key things we're going to look at. Before the fan vault, on the left, we've got a wooden vault, which is quite a complicated one. It's got 6 parts to it, and it's actually called a lierne, and that's a very old word, lierne, and it's to do with the French word to ligate, or to tie together. So the idea is all these ribs that go up from each pilaster reach the top of the ceiling in a rounded kind of bow shape, and then there are lots of crossbars in between them. So these lierne vaults are very, very complicated, and the fan vault was a development from the lierne, in which they tried to make everything a little bit simpler, to have less sort of subdivided sections. The lierne became also even more subdivided into the tierceron and various other things. And then once we get to the bottom picture here, we're looking at the ceiling of the most elaborate Gothic in England, and that's in Westminster. and that's called the Henry VII Chapel. So it's the Tudors that are really responsible for sponsoring these buildings after the Normans, and the Tudors continued this English idea of vaults and fans subdivided in a Gothic style well into the 16th century. So as I say, when already in Europe there was Palladian architecture, there was Michelangelo designing things like St. Peter's and knocking down the old Gothic, in England it continued. And so they were able to use the engineering of the Renaissance, the new ideas, the mathematics that they'd acquired to make something quite complicated like this. I mean, at first glance, what we're seeing on the ceiling is something like pendants that might remind us of falling stars or a constellation or some kind of map of the universe. It might be sort of a structural map of the heavens. So it does get very, very complicated. The idea of infinity and mathematics really dominates here. More vaults around the country. You see these coming up more or less at the same time. So you get these illustrated books in the 19th century showing different abbeys. So whether it be somewhere like Windsor or like St. George's Chapel or Bath Abbey. So going through just a few more pictures, here's a picture of Bath Abbey, and next to it something much simpler. So the fans at the top, in between which there are these lozenges, and then this ceiling here below is a rib vault. So there it's just square divisions, and the ribs are bare ribs in a way. They're just stripped down to the simplest idea. So it's just nice to go around different abbeys and research this subject, because you can see just how complicated it can be. So I've chosen this picture here, which is particularly interesting because it's also shot in a kind of wide angle lens. And I think that really gives you a good sense of going into the King's College. It's quite a narrow space, but it's actually one of the widest for its time. So even though it's very, very tall, it does sort of feel quite quaint and quite at home in there, and that's very good for the acoustic. But in this sort of text, when I was exploring the different sources, what I found out was that they had no idea about what it would look like at the beginning. And when they started building this under Henry VI and Richard III and all these people like this, they were just building the walls, and they knew that this project would probably take 300 or 400 years. So they had no idea what the design would be, and they probably didn't have the technology when they began. So they began with the windows, and in between them, these big, heavy pillars. And as that came up, it kind of fell into disrepair, and they just put a wooden beamed roof across. And in fact, they were having trouble because the width of it was just wider than a tree trunk that they could find as a standard length. So it was sort of just covered up with bits of wood knocked together for hundreds of years. And then it was Henry VIII who had this idea to finish what his father had done. And his father, Henry VII, was building Westminster Abbey really as a sort of mausoleum for himself. So Henry VIII came here and had both the organ commissioned. So all of these wooden parts, the choir and all these carved benches were made by Italian craftsmen, and they were made in a Baroque style. So you could see that was the fashion in Europe already at the time when they were finishing the ceiling. And then at the top, Henry VIII got this idea to create these fan vaults that seemed impossible because of their width. And so there was actually a superstructure of stone put up behind them or above them that would support this. So there's a sort of, it's a bit like a skyscraper where there's a hidden structure holding up this stone structure. And what does it look like? Well, it sort of appears like a spider web with these strange diamond shapes. And if we look closely into the diamond shapes, I've just got a few pictures beneath. I've got this idea of the heavens with the rose. And if we look closely at this photograph here, we see a Tudor rose. It's a kind of model of heaven, if you like. And the books that were written at the time, you know, books like Dante's Paradise, they were talking about the structure of heaven being made like a rose with hundreds and hundreds of petals, in which there were lots and lots of angels and different minds and different souls together. So the idea of God was like a kind of infinity, not like a single-minded creature, but a creature that was made up of all the intelligence of the world, like a supercomputer with many, many voices at the same time. So that's what made kind of the gods incomprehensible. And then obviously these rows of crosses and niches that look like little windows, they might be portals that lead into different dimensions in the heavens. And it also looks like a spider's web. That's the other symbols around the building. They're obviously portcullises, which again are the symbols of Parliament today, but they sort of also represent the state. So even though you've got the crown over the rose, you've also got the crown over the state. So this idea of the sovereign leader, and then obviously dragons and heraldic supporting figures, shields showing the union of the kingdoms of Scotland and Ireland and all the rest of that. Also the sort of the windows, so lots and lots of stained glass letting light in. And the roses and the pendants in Westminster, they're both made by the same builder, whose name is John Wastell. And this mason was overseeing lots and lots of works in different cathedrals. And what he was really trying to show here was that he could hang stone from the ceiling in an impossible way. So this would completely flabbergast anyone coming into the church, because they'd think that the stones couldn't possibly be hanging up there. And of course, if you look at this structure, how do you join a stone to another stone with nothing underneath? Well, actually, it would probably fall down. So it defeats logic. And this was the real virtuosic thing about the English Gothic that really didn't take off as much in France. I mean, in France, if you look at a vault somewhere like Reims, it might just be a circular mortise hole, or there might be some carved figures sort of in a bigger stone that's locked in there. But here, these stalactites, the trick is that Mr. Wastell actually used wood, and he joined that to the stone and covered it with powder. So the stone powder was actually coating this to make it look like it's made of stone, but it is actually impossible. So it's really exciting to discover these things, because if you go there, you're just going to see it, and you might not even think, how does this thing work? But actually, for me, it was a real discovery. And I was talking to stonemasons in the back of Gloucester and York, and these people were telling me how they were restoring the structures and how it works. There's a couple of other pictures. There's one in St Albans. I mean, there's pretty much in quite a few churches around England, you're going to find this in a smaller size or in different variants with different heraldry. But these beautiful fan shapes, they're particularly famous, and they're particularly beautiful. And the thing is that as you walk around them, they change direction. But the round form, it continues to turn, and so wherever you're looking at it from, it seems to be more static. So if you look at the other vaults, they are so complicated, and the lines change, they line up in different ways, and it feels like you're going through a kind of system of many, many different lines. Whereas with these fans, it's an early Gothic idea, but it was really taking off in the Renaissance. So just to finish off this, looking at this essay, this is a very early 13th century Gothic chapel, and it's in Paris. It's La Sainte-Chapelle, so it's much earlier than Notre Dame. Is the Chapel of the Kings. So Henry VIII had things like this to look at, and he was looking at how they were painted and how they were covered in wonderful stained glass. And, you know, the whole story of the Bible is in the stained glass as well, in the windows, telling the story. But here is the plan from a sort of bird's eye view, where you can see the really quite complex matrix of spider webs, if you like, or celestial structures. So here's a picture of Henry VIII himself, the man who finished the job. And as you can see, even the way he wears clothes is similar, because his decorations on his clothes are also sort of subdivided into hundreds of different gems and bits of fabric in these kinds of mesh fabric. And this is the kind of pattern that ornament really was going on in the Renaissance, and it worked in the churches, it worked in the clothes. So that's basically my talk, and I think like to practically try and work with this, we're going to just very quickly look at some of my sketches that I have before we start. So yeah, I'd like to just sort of go back to the meeting, and hopefully that's a sort of good introduction to what we're looking at. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to the stop screen sharing, and hopefully by this point, if you have your reference image, it's the one that I sent through. I'll just put that back on the screen for a second so that you can see that image. So here is this long photograph that we're going to work from. And now we can just unmute this part, and so now now can everybody hear me? Okay. So now I've got this sketch here, which is just a very simple idea of what we're going to do. And it's just done in black and blue ink with a little bit of white paint. And of course, the perspective of this complicated spider's web is what we're going to be looking at, how to structure this, where stages of Gothic arches diminish into space. So I'm just going to take it away, I think, and set it up so that we can start working practically. So I'd like you to just try and think of a point somewhere in the middle, something like a dot that's going to be our vanishing point. And that's going to be quite key because it's the vanishing point and it's a 1 point perspective. So everything is going to be coming towards this vanishing point at the end of the space in the altar. And that's sort of the focal point of the picture. So from there, I'd like to just draw a vertical line. You can do this freehand, you don't really need a ruler. But if you want a ruler, you're very welcome to use it. So this is the sense of the space traveling down towards the invisible point. And in that space, we're going to just try and divide it into several arches. The easiest way to do that is to just try and think of 2 more lines that will help us radiate out from that point. So this is the sort of sense of lines going in. So hopefully it's equal spaces and we see this traveling down into nothing. And then the first space we're going to do is a very simple Gothic arch. So it's got a pointy beginning and then it's going to be as wide as possible. So we're just drawing a freehand curve, hitting that point. And at that point there, another curve, and we can just measure the width of this. So we know it's going to be the same amount of radius. So here's the second curve going down this way. So this is our Gothic arch, and as I say, it appears in lots and lots of Oriental and Asian architecture. So if you look at a mosque, it's often got a similar arch. And this is why this is such a wide space, because this arch can go up to a very nice locking point where basically, if you think of it as stones, they can just press one into the other. So they just hold each other up. And so all this force is traveling left and right along the stones. And then at a certain point on the exterior, the buttress on the outside of the pier, so the pier is where the arch sits on, the buttress supports that from the outside. So it can either be a flying buttress, or it can just be a sort of series of widening steps going down. But that's sort of not part of the drawing. I think we're looking at the interior. I just wanted to do that to explain how this is holding the weight of that and stopping the column from falling down that way. So the sort of exterior forces are going to the right, and then the interior forces are going in from the left. And at this sort of point here, the forces stop. So all of these arched stones, or the voussoir of the stone, is locked in this position, and then at the top it leans against the exact same other one from the other side. So that's our sort of structure, and these are just sketching. It's not very important, but what is important, I think, is the vertical space in between. So we've got the Gothic arch sat upon two vertical sides. Okay, so the next thing to do is to probably have a division of different spaces. Now, let's say we do 5 different arches. They've got to kind of shrink. So along here, if we just look at this space, we can divide it into 5 parts, but we need to think that they get smaller and smaller. So if we get a very, very small one like this first, then we can look across, and if we've got exactly the same amount, we can add a little bit to it so that it grows. And then again, and again. So making them get slightly wider each time. So this is just sort of a little plan, and we can look at this as an idea that they grow. So if that's slightly smaller than that one, slightly smaller than that one, what is the proportion? Well, it's something like the golden section, for example. So if you added this up, it would kind of add up to the next bit and the next bit and the next bit. So it's sort of just over half between. So it's a smaller part, then a bigger part, then a slightly bigger part, and a bigger part. So let's see if we can just have 5 points and then move them over to the other side so that they meet up. So let's just measure like this. From the middle, we're measuring to the first one. And then from there, from the middle to the second one. From the middle to the third one. And the fourth. So this is how they're slightly getting bigger. So let's just see if we can come up with a second arch. So just try and get these points in, and then try and draw some more arches, and just leaving a space. So each time they get smaller. So from here as well, try and draw a second arch coming down, and then at a certain point getting into a straight. So once we got these first 2 arches in, what we can do is just look at where the start of the arch is and just put a very faint line, and that will give us the perspective of the shrinking vertical piers, so that we know that along here all the piers are going to get smaller and smaller and hit this line, because that's going to be our straight space going into the distance. And then we can just try and draw this triangle a little bit clearer, so that we can see that we basically ended up with 2 long triangles and some divisions in space that slightly shrink each time. And if we were going to put the next one in, it would probably be again over halfway across, so that'd be really, really small. And that's a sort of idea how they will look. So once everyone's getting to this point, I think we can try to sketch in, so leaving a little space below, about the same but slightly less than that, we're going to sketch the second arch in and sketch the other side of it. If it looks slightly uneven, you can, this is a good thing about just being light with the pencil. You can just look at the space in between them. And if something needs to come out a bit more or come in a bit, that's the time to do it just before we actually put any paint down or anything or any ink. So each time it's going up and getting smaller. So it has to look that this distance is longer and then the next distance is slightly shorter. So that's sort of a sketching way of looking and making sure that everything lines up into the logical division of the space. So before we've got anything, we've got this central rib or the central sort of meeting point of the two arches, and then the arches coming together from the vertical up. So hopefully we end up with these spaces, and each time they look more and more narrow. So if you get any kind of gaps that look a little bit wide, just try and build up a bit more line. So at the moment, this is sort of just geometrical. And how did they do these things? They were tracing them on the ground with calipers. So they probably have an instrument that was, two sticks tied together with a pin, where they could measure things like the sort of medieval, you get them on a lot of different heraldry and the Masonic symbol. These calipers are sort of what they use to measure stone. And also it's what a lot of images show God measuring the earth with. So the famous William Blake drawing of God with these calipers in his hand. And of course, they could use them as a compass and they could trace perfect curves. But, we're sketching, so we're not doing it to that degree of exactitude. I think the main thing is to get a very nice sense of a space sketched in as it shrinks into space and diminishes in scale. So hopefully you feel that you've got these different bays represented by these dividing lines. Okay, the other thing that we've got is the lozenges. So they're going to fit into this central part that we did at the beginning. And they are the sort of actors in this play, like the most important image of the rose suspended in midair, the impossible stone, that's sort of the round keystone. So the first thing to do is to just try and draw in perspective. So if we think of this as a box where we just draw two straight lines across, we can think of a circle that somehow fits into this box. So if we just cross the corners of this box like that, we can find the diagonal lines that will make the space divide properly. So in that, we've got the bigger triangle to the front, really close to us, and the one just behind it that looks a little bit smaller because of this shrinkage in space. So if we were going to do also then a horizontal bar across, that will remain completely horizontal. And obviously we're going to have to do this on each stage. And in this, we've got the four sides where the first line is longer than the second. And you can see the diagonal diminishing line in space each time. So we're just looking at finding the perspectival center of each of these beautiful niches, these beautiful lozenges. But the lozenges will go around elliptical shapes, and that's how to sort of constantly find these bigger parts that are nearer to us in perspective, and then the smaller parts as well. So Yeah, that one, I think I might need to do it a little bit taller. So this is where you can catch yourself out. So just make sure that it feels like the space is organic enough, but it's also that the spaces aren't too different to each other. So try and create some boxes on each sort of level, and using the edges of this line that gets smaller and smaller into the middle. So there we have these 5 boxes. And so if we then put these horizontal staves in, these divisions like that, we end up with sort of star shapes. And so we can use these star shapes to just do a kind of elliptical shape in perspective, where the trick about ellipses, and this is what people often get wrong, is that they try and draw the 2 sort of sides join, and then they end up with a sharp edge, which kind of looks like an almond. So you want to avoid that, because if it's a circle that's been shrunken in space, you just want to round it off. So that's sort of kind of getting towards the turn in the curve, and then just rounding it off by trying to keep the pencil in one movement, if you like, and then getting ever closer to the back. And there we get the sort of second half that's smaller of the ellipse, and the first half that's bigger. And then again, on the next level, if we just plot the width of these boxes, we can look at this, and we can sort of look at the shape of that triangle against that triangle and flip that over. And there we get this sort of elliptical shape of the flowers in the middle. So let's just try and practice this again. Just working, sometimes I just do a sort of bracket shape, and then work the curve into it, like as if you were going to put something in brackets like this, and then just sort of put a much longer curve in. So as it gets smaller and further away, this shrinks. So, you could fit probably 10 of these into this. So you're ending up with a kind of train track of diminishing flowers. And of course, each of these flowers, we can then think of how it's shaped. If we look back at the photographs before, or if you try and remember how the Tudors would kind of decorate and create a ornate style for this, they might sort of put little petals in that look very symmetrical and mathematical. So, you might have a central stem of the flower, and then concentric diagonal flower petals, kind of, so everything is symmetrical. So let's try and just build up a kind of chainmail structure of carved shapes, and then put that in a frame, because that's the sort of thing that they would do in this architecture, is that everything would have a rib or a frame going around it. So I'll leave it a little bit open to how you think that the Tudor rose might be shaped. But I think the best thing to do is just to start with a middle that's a sort of a little bit higher and divided into 3 petals that get smaller and smaller each time. So obviously, as it gets to the back, it's very hard to draw this accurately. So really, you want to just have a suggestion of it. And so the main shape, and then just around it, put some diagonal petals in that will just go in a framework, and maybe just in between them, smaller petals, and then just frame all of that with another elliptical border like that. So we're just looking at the first thing that comes to mind when you're looking at the whole thing is these pendants, these suspended flowers that seem to be impossibly hanging up in the vault of this ceiling. And you know, you can just spend a little bit of time designing them, but really what we're looking at is the surface areas that are going to catch the light, because in the carving, obviously the light comes in from the left and right through these Gothic windows. And so the sides, as the sun goes along the 12 bays of the building during the day, you know, at midday, it might be somewhere in the middle, but the shadows and light will change. So, you know, we'll think about that later. But I think the most important thing is to have these roses in. And then we're also going to just try and create diamond shapes. So by just going around this ellipse, we can try and create a lozenge that's going to get smaller and sort of pointy towards the ends. So each time we're going to just try and get that to meet up. So connecting each lozenge with the pointy ends like this. Ends up with a structure that is in the center of these fans. So the edges of the fans will hit the slightly curved lozenge indented lines. So that's sort of the first stage of this row of things happening in the building. So that's very, very pretty, but you know, how does it stay up? The key to that is going to be more things in perspective, and that's going to be the windows. So looking at the windows, they are divided arches. So the Gothic arch on its own, just like this Gothic arch, but in the lateral sense. So in between the sort of supporting ribs of this whole vault. So if we just start from this far side, we've got two pillars that are either side of a space. And obviously, as I drew on the other side, they're supported from the outside by a buttress. But we can't really see that very well. What we do see is that we need to somehow divide this space. And again, looking at this, we need a bigger half and then a smaller. And again, in each part, if we just try and find the middle of each Gothic arch from the side, we're just going to try and simply mark in a way that the first half is bigger than the second. And, you know, making sure that, you know, we can also then thicken some of these parts up. But if we're looking for the middle part where the Gothic arch will form, we're just marking in. So dividing the space up into slightly over half towards the nearer part, and then again and again. So each time this is a bigger distance, and a bigger distance in the space. So if we're traveling in perspective, you know, we can put other lines in if we want, just to get that sense of things in a row moving in further. And from this top part here, just beneath the line, we'd like to try and create an arch. So just try and draw a Gothic pointy arch like this. So there are many different ways of constructing this out of stone, but the simplest way would have two stones that had a triangular decorative part carved in, and those are called spandrels. But we don't need to really worry about that too much. The main thing being that one stone leans against the other. And a lot of this has been discussed in John Ruskin's book, The Stones of Venice, where he's looking at lots of different windows and the shapes of them in sort of Venetian buildings, which were used as an example, really, by all these architects in the revival period, because they looked at how, you know, simple structures were often so decorated that it was hard to see what they were actually made of. So that confused, the exterior of the stone confused the eye. And the next sort of thing is to try and put these arches in a way where we start with vertical sides, and then just before reaching the top, try and continue that Gothic shape each time trying to meet the two parts. but making sure that the nearer part is bigger and then getting smaller and smaller again. So just using these vertical lines and then using any sort of sketchy lines to make sure that everything lines up, so that you know that the vertical parts will go down from the place where the curve ends. So if we're doing something very small later, it would also fit on the sort of edge of that line. So we've got Gothic windows introduced in between the pillars here, and we've been ending up with, say, 4 here, and then probably a really tiny one somewhere in there. So that is going towards nothing. But we don't need to worry too much in the middle, because everything in the end will be blocked by Henry VIII's organ, the musical instrument that was designed by Italian carvers to sort of have 2 different styles in the building, and as a wedding present for Anne Boleyn. And one of the very strange things that you can find on that organ is a carved head of a kind of Medusa that Anne Boleyn was represented as after she was beheaded. So it was a wedding present, and then it took such a long time for the organ to be built that eventually she was dead by the time it was finished. So a grotesque image of her is on the wood carving on the side of the organ. So if you ever go to King's College Chapel, look for that, because that's a very strange and gory thing to put in a church. But obviously it was part of Henry VIII's kind of moving away from the Catholic establishment. So Henry VIII is, the first Church of England king, and before him, Henry VII is the last Catholic king in that period, in the Tudors. So let's just have a look. How can we move this gallery across to the other side? Well, just try and get your verticals in as sort of divisions, and then just beneath them, if you plot some little dots on the top of these vertical spaces, we can put vertical lines in on the middle line, and then using that middle line, we can run that all the way along, and then just use that to meet the 2 parts of the Gothic arch. So just imagining that the same logic of the vaulting is working in the windows. And this really wouldn't work with the Romanesque round arch, because the Romanesque arches would be down here. And then that would mean that the whole space would be much, much smaller because of the possibilities of the weight in there of the stone. So really, that was the revolutionary thing from the 12th century onwards, was very, very wide Gothic spaces and maximum amount of light as a result of these very wide arches with very thin parts in between them. So that was the virtuosic thing of the carvers showing off, and the stonemasons showing off here. Just making sure that that kind of lines up together. So we're ending up with these 5 windows on each side, and we can use that later to sort of flash light through. And while we're sort of here, what would be nice is to divide them into the little stone mullions as well. So if you've got this middle line, we can actually just go over that, and then we can put some mullions in either side of it, just to create this sense of perpendicular lines. And this is actually a perpendicular style when all these windows have vertical lines going up. So just put some lines either side of the middle line in these windows, just to suggest that kind of cage-like thing happening. And it's going to be more beautiful than that, because we're going to draw in some Gothic arches in between and things like that. So it's not just vertical lines, but the basic structure of it is these vertical lines. So just spend a couple of minutes doing that and filling in this sort of space there as it shrinks into the middle and goes in. And that's the basic Gothic shape of many, many vaults. So that's what we're going to use to then put the fans in. And the fans are going to be very, very beautiful, because they're going to be a completely secondary system, a system that will confuse the eye. So this is why it's very, very important to do it in stages, as I was doing it earlier, because your eye follows lines and it can go off in any tangent. So if you don't have the structure in first, it's going to be very difficult to see this. But the idea of these ribs growing out of an arch in either direction is the idea of these vaults. So they're shooting out and growing up in different directions. And I think the easiest thing to do is to think of this shape, the negative shape between the lozenges, as the edge of each fan. So we can just try and draw a curve, like a sort of curve in perspective, where the top of a fan is curving along the rim of this lozenge that's nearer to us, and then just working a much sharper curve in. So in the space, before we draw any ribs or any subdivisions, it's really nice to see how these fans work across the Gothic arch, so that the thick arch that's holding up the structure is also serving to hold up the stone fans that create all these different planes as they curve round. So it's basically like half an elliptical shape, but bigger in the space in between the lozenges. So each time we do that, we're just going to make sure that this curve crosses the rib of the vault, and just try and work those in. So we're going to have these shrinking in space as well. So each time they get slightly smaller and slightly more hooked because of it. So there as well, sort of have them crossing the shape of that arch. So if it doesn't fit together, you can change things around at this earlier stage and just try and keep those vaults in the middle. So we've got a set of curves of fans moving around in the space, and hopefully once you've got those in, you can also try and think of it as a continuing beyond the structure, because it's also going to be working right into a space that we're occupying above our heads. So we don't need to stop there, even though I had that as the top of the picture. It will get bigger and bigger again. So we can just try and use that to illustrate how beautiful this will be in a larger format as well at the front. So we're ending up with 4 or 5, not 5 on each side, so that's 10 fans, if you like. And in each fan, we've got an arch in the middle. So that's really key to this beautiful design. So just try and go over the arch again, just thicken up the lines and try and get them to look very rigid, and because they're the ones that are actually porting all the weight down to the sides of the structure. But these sort of ghost arches will work into that. And the idea of this is that each set of ribs comes together into one very thin pilaster. So these are the pilasters that were already there before the builders could come in and design this. So let's just have a look at these on the side. They're going to be a little bit like a flute, really, a vertical flute that's just protruding out into the space. So it's a little bit thicker and a bit further forward than the windows. So just put in some thick lines to give that Gothic arch each time a little bit stronger structure, something that looks like it's on its own separately. So in between the windows, I'm just putting in kind of 2 sides of a pillar. So these pillars replace the column. If the sort of Roman column before was, you know, a thing with a capital. All of that was sort of simplified into these much thinner looking flutes that could go up. And then with the same logic, there might be a little bit of a change, but really in this design, the idea is that they just get thicker. So there really isn't any capital. So once you've got these 5 flutes in, we can just try and put 2 sides to that arch together and just draw around the faint line and make something a little bit more defined. And that's a really easy thing for the eye to follow. And it will split the fans in half as well. So let's just try and put that together so that we end up with a very easy to read double-sided Gothic arch. Now the mathematics in this, it seems very daunting, but if you take each section separately and just use the middle to start with, it makes it a lot easier to take apart and put back together again. So these are the Gothic ribs in the barrel of the ceiling going along. And then we've got those curved lines crossing them. So what happens next? Well, the easiest thing to do is to look at the middle of each lozenge and go from there. And actually what happens is the line in between, so the line halfway along here, will connect to the top of the window. So if we just draw a nice faint line in between like this, from the top of the Gothic arch of the window to the lozenge, and just connect those lines, that will make it much easier to divide in half. And that's the 2 sides of a fan, like the 2 ends of a fan anyway. So that goes up like this as a sort of cross stave. And so we end up with a halved space of each half of each quarter of a vault. And then the Gothic arch is really something quite simple, but it's something that keeps growing and changing angle. So once you've got these half lines in, we can take the corners of a space like this and try and just make a sort of Gothic arch shape travel up there. So it's as if the window is rocketing off towards the lozenge. And as it does that, it'll change into many, many different ribs. But the start of that is the same as with the earlier vaults, is that the ribs continue off the window into the ceiling. And you can always check this along with the perspective line. And if something looks like it's too high, like there, just lower it down, make sure it's all lined up. So just put in a line, I think that's the easiest thing to do, and connect from the vertical parts something that is like a rib that runs along the ceiling. And then it sort of goes up. And if you put another point in, it sort of turns into something that looks like an arrowhead. So that then goes up again. So from that level there, just looking towards the vanishing point, everything is shrinking. And we can actually put in more ribs that fit into there. So just try and work along in a logical sequence. So that sort of creates different geometrical planes as the stone or the bricked in bits in between, or originally it would have been wood, but as that travels up, it sort of changes angle and begins to sort of turn into a fan. So one of the other things is that obviously a rib from this pillar is coming up and then circling round. So if we look at these spaces, if we just keep plotting some dots up, they can come up like this and keep making sharper and sharper arrows. So it's a sort of like a crossword where you're just filling in all these spaces, where they just kind of go up in sequences of arrows until they hit the kind of end. And then when they do that, they get very distorted. And so because of that, then from the corner of the rose, there's another little added stave that goes to the middle of the lozenge. So all these lines work together. So we've just kind of drawn the side of a fan growing along the arch until it turns very nicely around. So from all these dots, we can plot a line into the middle like this, and then just continue doing that along, smaller and smaller as they fit in. So in that grid, the idea is that each time these Gothic arches create a sort of arrowhead that eventually hits the side of a round fan. So once they start to look like something, we get this very, very beautiful set of arches growing up in a row, one after another. And then on the other side, again, the same. So that's the sort of penultimate stage of the drawing bit. Well, I mean, of the major drawing of this. So let's just see if we look at these arches. I've kind of ended up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little arches on top of a window. So we've got 2 here, and I'll just try and plot some more so that I end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the 6th one, which will be on the edge of each fan. So I'm just trying to draw these lines out, projecting into the space, and then do it again. So that's going up a stage. So each time they go up a stage, they become steeper. And so because of that, the whole facet inside of stone or wood or whatever it would be originally would turn in. And because of that, it sort of unfolds in the space. And these sort of delta-shaped arches will eventually form these beautiful fans as they kind of cross a threshold in which they start to sort of turn the other way. So first they're kind of running along the space, and then they're starting to turn the other way. So each time you see that these fan shapes are going to start to appear with that. Okay, so that's one sense of all this arching and growing towards the turn. And then as we had these sort of bracket shapes, what we can do is try and think of them as having different subdivided lines that are kind of conical. So we're trying to describe the surface of them now. And the surface is going to be set up in a way that you're going to have kind of all these ribs going up to different points, and then some curved lines. And so you've got the first curved line, and then after that, we're going to have a second curved line. So where does that start? Well, you've got these curved lines coming towards this division here, and then you've got this second space. So it's as if like the cone is going round like this. So it's maybe at the top of, say, the 4th position here, the 4th Gothic arch here, you can put in a sort of curved space that repeats that. And you can do this all the way along in between the tops of these things. So it's a bit like, jumping across and making this rounded. So that again, on the other side, if we've got this happening towards here, we've got this second curve hitting and jumping up in the opposite direction. And it's a round shape. So it's a Gothic shape that meets a kind of Roman shape, something a little bit older. And so the division here at the top. What's happening at the bottom? Well, all these ribs are grouping together until they hit the middle line. And then you can just try and put in another set of cone shapes in between, like this, at the bottom of each kind of tree, that's just holding all the ribs together. So where does that happen? Well, it happens across the middle bar. So if you look where the middle bar is, and just say on the second or third arch up, try and create a sequence of jumping curves across there. So those beautiful shapes start to appear. They travel in. So actually all these little curves start to come together into sort of grouped or massed branches. So have a go at that and see if you can create these rows of rounded curves that get smaller and smaller and meet up. So you can also just try and go around the edge of the middle ones and then double up the line so that you can really see them as separate to the whole Gothic mesh here. And also, the other beautiful thing is that you can subdivide them and add extra bars. So if you're looking at how this middle of the lozenge hit that line, in the middle of the next lozenge, there might be an added bar, and that kind of completes each separate section. So that's from the middle of the lozenge, or in perspective, obviously, down this shape of this fan is an added little bar. And the same going the other way. So if there's one there, there's also going to be one there, and all the way along. So that middle of the lozenge is going to be the sort of place where another rib is added. And because of that, all these fans start to look more together like a fan because of the way that that's coming together. So obviously a very complex structure. And if you're working out into the exterior part, you can also see how you feel if you can try and evenly put in some more ribs that just kind of come down into these fan shapes. So there's two parts to each fan really here. There's this sort of thing curving round and working down like a cone into the nothingness of a pillar, or growing outwards from the pillar. And then there's also the arches in between them, which kind of connect to the flatness of each wall. So that's sort of the very complex spider web structure. The other thing too in this space, I think would be nice, once you've sort of got that idea of this framework going, you might put another lozenge or half lozenge in with another bit of rows there. But the other thing is the space of the actual room, and just looking below this shape. If we go to the floor, we want to put in some lines below the vanishing point. So if that's the middle of the room and that's the area where our light, the eye is standing, so as a person is standing in the room, everything above that point is above their head, sort of thing, and everything below that point is below their eye line. So if we just draw the central line coming down, we can also put some diagonal lines, we can try and create a triangle basically like this, and we can just check that that's the right length in each direction, just to make sure that the two halves of the triangle look the same. And we're going to use that to then put the organ in and the pews. So the pews could run along the triangle, and if you just put in vertical corners of a box like that, you can connect in perspective the edges of the pews, and then just put in a horizontal line like this, like that. So, you know, it might take a little while to get a sense of everything in here, but what I want to do is to try and have the ceiling and the floor working all towards this one vanishing point. And on the floor, there could be some squares because it's a marble floor, it's very decorative. So if we just sort of halve that triangle into a much sharper one like this, we can use these square spaces to try and plot squares getting bigger towards us. So using the back of the box to have the back of a square, and then it's going to be black marble tiles. So we're going to have a thick square on the floor. And a second thick square on the floor. And you know, in between that is going to be white marble tiles, but it doesn't really matter so much. I think the main thing is to divide that space up so that we've got this walkway, and it actually goes through an arch in the organ. So at the back of this square, just below us, is the arch of the organ. So I can line that up like this, like a sort of round arch like this, a doorway just behind the floor, and a box around that. So actually that's why it won't matter so much what's happening beyond that point, because we can create a box that will have sort of several thick sides to it, and it interrupts the space. And what's interesting about this is that because it interrupts the space, it seems like it's being inside a mirror, or like a, you know, it's as if it goes on forever. So if we put an organ box on top of this Gothic arch here, it interrupts everything with the straight sides of a sort of Vitruvian, you know, square shape from the Renaissance. And obviously there'll be some organ pipes in there. And everything is dark mahogany stained wood. So obviously, you know, that is going to be just cropping off the Gothic arches and overlapping everything. And so all this drama coming in will lead to a very static set of coordinates. And we can, you know, take a thick pen or something like that, and just like an ink pen, for example, and just put in that organ as something that interrupts everything else. So how does the organ look? Well, it's got this kind of square frame, and it's sitting on top of a doorway. And actually the pipes kind of work in a very nice way, like this, sort of concave shapes going down in a sequence as the pipes get smaller. So that's another thing, that the perspective in this space is sort of echoed by the shrinking pipes. So just inking that box together will give us the wooden framework, and there might be some pinnacles on the corners of the organ, and just going to black all of that in so that we're left with the doorway and the mahogany paneling that is where the carved figures are going to be. So that has to look very, very strong up against that structure, and the flanks of it as well. If you just ink that in, that's a quick way of rendering that position of that. And so working with the choir stalls where the actual King's College choir sings from, we've got the front of these pews where they have the kneeling bar and the book. And then if we just try and use that line again, we can try and create much wider triangles or lines that come out in much longer senses. So sort of like radiating out in both directions. And then we've got this horizontal line. So the tricky thing about that is it'll look really contrived if we leave the edge of the back of the pews on that line, and that's sort of on our eye level, so it's probably just above there. So by curving that line in a little bit more and going across the windows, going a little bit kind of around the clock that way, and sort of measuring that as, you know, only a small amount of height there, we can just plan this space out, and it obstructs the windows. It's another very strong intervention in the space. So panels of wood would have been prepared and stuck in there, and they're very dark. So I think the best thing to do is to get ink and just, you know, use a pen or a felt tip or something. Maybe if you have a pen or something darker, that can just break this away and just create these wood edges, these edges of panel that are not Gothic at all. They're all based on rectilinear shapes in perspective. And these rectilinear shapes, they relate to all the kind of Baroque consoles and all the architecture that we looked at before in the classical period, that was actually coming back into fashion well against this Gothic style. And you know, we can just hatch that down and maybe just diagonally create some darker hatching just to take that away from all the space, and that creates a kind of contre-jour, a kind of silhouette with the mullioned windows. So that is a quick way to just take that back with a bit of hatching and shading, and, you know, we can do diagonal if you like, cross hatching, just to get that flatness and sense of something completely interrupting the Gothic. And the choir, obviously, they're usually dressed in a very ornate way. They've got red velvet and they've got white garments, so they stand out very well against this. And you're very welcome to draw in, you know, maybe some little silhouette of somebody in a white gown, maybe a row of people in a white gown in here, and they will stand like soldiers in a row, and, you know, you can see their clothes against this very dark space. It makes it very dramatic as a spectacle to watch, as well as being you know, a musical acoustic feast. So just drawing the kind of bars of the pews in front of those in perspective, and just putting the lines in ever wider as they come towards us. So that kind of makes the rest of the space work in there like that. And I think this is a good stage to try and think of light and shadow and color in the picture, because at the moment everything is a little bit like a matrix or a framework. So I think a good thing to do now would be to get some little amount of color. I think maybe the easiest thing to do is some colored pencils like that. So that would be a dry and very quick way of working. And I think take a yellow crayon and let's think about what stone was actually used. So there's actually two different kinds of stone from York and from a quarry that was quite far up north, and because of that the stone was yellow. So if you think of cathedrals in the north, they go from a shade of yellow like Lincoln Cathedral or York, and then they go into very dark reds in places like Durham in Northumberland and Scotland. The color, the geological color of stone changes. So we're actually looking at kind of an off yellow stone. So let's just try and scribble in a bit of color just to separate sort of the spaces from the blank spaces in between as well, just to get that sense of a building made of the color of a stone that's natural and there's no paint involved. Even though I showed you Sainte-Chapelle in Paris was painted, and in some cases they think a lot of abbeys were painted, I think one of the things here is that the Tudors left everything to its own natural color. So just by kind of swirling the pencil line along these cone shapes, I think we can just try and shade in all the material and the planes of that material with pencil. And then when we're working on the flat surfaces, you know, you can go quite flat up and down. So just try and create, first of all, the color of the material, and not to worry too much about light and shadow yet, but just to fill in this space logically, we're going to try and use the directional shading of the color to kind of enhance the sense that everything is made of this stone. So try and shade in a round zigzag along each of the cones of these fans. And that's a really nice thing to do. And then once we've got that, we can just do flat vertical shading in between the lozenges to show that that's a ceiling. So the first thing to do is just to cover all that with a bit of yellow, and then maybe just to darken it, because all the light comes in from the side, and as these vaults travel up, actually it gets darker on the flat surfaces of the ceiling. So if you combine the gray of the pencil with the yellow, that can give a nice ambient sort of effect. So just shading in between the fans will isolate the fans and give them a bit more body. And then as the ribs of the fans come round, well, some of the parts could catch light and others could be darker, but I think it does get darker just inside in between. So if we just scribble shading into the bits in between, we can use that, or we can use a color. I could say take a purple crayon or something, or a blue or something like that, and just darken in between in the spaces where very little light can come in, because if the light's coming in through the window like that, just above it, the geometry of these niches will get darker. So on both sides, really. Just darken in between the stone, and then that sort of gives it a bit more three-dimensional look. And then I'm going to take a bit more yellow and just try and fill in now along here all of the white left in the paper. And again on the other side. And if anything's left like that wall, just try and fill everything up like that with the color of the stone. Then the color of the stone also will work up the Gothic arches that we did at the beginning. And I think there we can really thicken that up with yellow and make it as dense as possible, because those are the structural things. And then they're also the things dividing up each fan. So these ribs really need to be brought to a kind of major accent in the space. And they're going to be just the color of the stone, really. And it's a slightly darker yellow crayon I've got, but the idea being that they have to be quite densely colored in. So that's quite pretty. But then also there's going to be shadow. And I think we can take a ink pen or something quite dark to try and get some of these shadows in. So some of the stronger shadows might just happen at the top of these Gothic arches. So as the wall hits the ceiling, these places here are going to be quite dark. So just going over these curved lines, these Gothic arches at the bottom would be one way to make this feel more drawn in. And then what happens in between them? Well, there are lots and lots of things happening. And I think if we take the ink and just put it in between the petals of the roses, that could be one way to make that rose thing feel much more three-dimensional and important as it kind of comes out in the space. So that's just carvers' chisels creating little undercuts in the stone. So all the spaces in between where they've carved away, they're not going to let light in, and it just makes it much easier to read. So all those lines we did at the beginning, we can just use them to sort of fill in the ink in between the little frames and in between the petals. So that makes those things work back in space. And then what happens on the ribs? Well, in the spider's web, I think one of the things we can do is, I mean, if we look closely into there might be some carved decoration. But I think the easiest thing to do at the beginning is just to try and make some of these ribs a little bit more 3D and just to go over them. And just to create this framework that just highlights the shape of the cones. So there we go. There's my clock going off at 7:38, 9. So I don't know how much more time we've got here, but I think the point being is that if you want to finish this off, just try and put these lines on the parts of the fans that are the most distinctive on the edges, and maybe just use the ink pen again to just go over some of these ribs and bring them forward. And if you want to, you can also just put a little bit of shadow just on the far side, away from the windows. So that will just make things look a little bit more 3D as well, if you put ink on the far side of the ribs. So just go over some of these curves and try and bring together some of the ribs that go in and out of each cone or fan. And if you want to decorate the windows as well, on the little middle line that we did before, if we ink that up, we can use that to put little Gothic arches in between. So all those lines we did before, we can put little Gothic arches in there and run them along, getting smaller and smaller. So that's another thing you can do, just to give the windows a bit of character. Obviously, you know, if you've got different colors, you can use the different colors, like say a little bit of red crayon. And if you just put in little sporadic red dots, that can make the stained glass look more alive. And, you know, it doesn't have to take too long, but we're not drawing the individual sort of pictures, but the suggesting the different colors coming through the window. So you can take another color like blue and just crayon that in between in these different sporadic positions. And you can even take yellow, and with the yellow, you can actually shine light through by just putting little rays of light from each window. And you can do that on both sides if you like, just to give that kind of aura of light and rays bouncing on some of the different shapes around there. And then just to finish off, really, I think the other thing you can do too is if you get a little bit of Tipp-Ex or white paint or anything like that, and you can just think, well, what is going to catch the light in this picture? So you don't need to do a lot, but if you think, you know, a light ray or something like that is coming out, and it might be hitting the sides of some of the roses. So, you know, you might just put a few dots on the sides of these roses and a few little white lines along the edges of the fans. That's another thing you can do too, just to make the fans look more contrasting. So it doesn't have to be ever so complicated, but what it can do is just remind us of the general shape of this carving in here by highlighting some of the ribs there. And that goes for the same with the little subdivided ribs. You know, it doesn't have to be everywhere, but I think it can be nice just to have a little bit of contrast and just put in very thin white lines running along. And the same with the big Gothic arches too. All of these structures that we've been drawing earlier, they can actually get a little bit of life by just having contrast running along them. So we can just highlight them. And that kind of brings light into the room, just with white paint, vis-a-vis all of this complex forest of things. And so it's the ribs that will actually read. And that's why I think you can just spend a few minutes highlighting the architecture. Great. So hopefully this sketch will work for you, and you know, it gives you a kind of guide or a pattern to follow, and then you know you can make it more and more complicated as you see fit. You can put more shadows in. It's kind of from there on. I'd love to see what you end up with. So do post everything that you've made on our page, and if you have any further questions, just contact me in the group. I can't hear you, so I don't know. I think the best thing to do is if anybody wants to type anything, you can ask me in the chat. Otherwise, we can just chat on the group afterwards. Okay, so I think at this point, I will photograph what I've got and post that up as well in the group. And so then hopefully we're going to end up with lots of very different architecture from before, and this is a nice guide to lead you into English Gothic. And next time you go to a service, you know, you can sort of try and look at this structure and try and read it as a kind of map of the heavens, and look at all the different lines in between the arches and appreciate it a lot better. So thank you very much, and hopefully see you next time. And I really look forward to seeing what you've come up with. Okay, all the best. Bye-bye.